Tanium's Comply module is packing on the innovation. Now scan inside applications for component level vulnerabilities, see where your known exploited vulnerabilities are, and manage the exceptions. Welcome back to Tanium Tech Talks. I'm your host, Ashley McGlone. And if you've been watching this show very long, it's no surprise that we take your feedback very seriously. And Tanium has put a lot of focus lately on vulnerability scanning capabilities. And we continue to add value to this popular module you probably already own. And here to demo the latest enhancements is Joel Gordon, who holds the Tanium Tech Talk title as the most featured guest on this show. So welcome, Joel, to your fourth show. Introduce yourself for our audience, those who may not have met you yet.
Hey, Ashley. Thanks for having me. My name is Joel Gordon. I'm a technical product manager here at Tanium. I've been working with the Comply solution now for almost 4 years, I would think, at this point. So, like I said, fourth time on the show. We've got a lot of exciting new updates here to share with our guests, and excited to talk to you about them today.
You know, we're a couple minutes into the show already, and I haven't mentioned Converge yet. Surprise. Well, yep. So several of the labs this year are going to focus on our Tanium Comply module. So Joel, tell us about, today we're talking about SBOM, we're talking about managing exceptions and so forth, CISA KEV. Tell us what people can expect to see in the labs at Converge this November around Comply.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've got quite a few folks on our team getting ready for Converge this coming November. And with the new features that we've got, across the platform, there's going to be a lot of new exciting things for folks to get their hands on. With Comply, as you mentioned, we've added new capabilities with extending the SBOM functionality into Comply for our vulnerability assessments. We finally added exception management, which is a big ask for customers over the years to have that capability within the Comply module. And picking up on one of the things that we teased on our last show, we now have the full integration with the CISA KEV, which is the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, to be able to identify vulnerabilities in your environment that have active exploits in the wild. So we've got some new cool dashboards around that, as well as having that capability available for all of your exports and feeds for Comply.
Hands-on labs again, right? You can do them in person at Austin, Texas this year at the Fairmont, where we'll be back there again in November the 13th to the 16th, or you can do them remotely, virtual experience as well. So go to converge.tanium.com and sign up for those labs before they fill up, because they do fill up. You want to get there and get there soon. Also, I should mention, if funding is a challenge for you, talk to your account team. They might be able to squirrel a pass for you. So there's some options there as well. So Joel, I know the last time you were here, we talked about Comply investigations, finding out, hey, why did this rating come back the way it did, particularly in the compliance scanning, right? But today we're going to talk, sounds like more about vulnerability scanning. So we've kind of hinted a little bit at some of these new features. And so now we just talked about the labs. Now we're going to kind of show you some of the things that you'll get to do in those labs, some of these capabilities you'll get to explore. So Joel, take it away, man. What are you going to demo for us today?
Absolutely. So we'll get started right here in the Comply module. And before I really dive into what this new feature brings to Comply, I want to kind of just start out and set the scene. As you mentioned, the SBOM feature is something that we've now had in Tanium for over a year now. And our asset module really kind of spearheaded this capability of doing inventory of your software bill of materials, right? One of the things that our friend and colleague Roland has brought up in the past is what SBOM is really allowing us to do is understand how your cookies are made. What are the ingredients, right? And in certain situations, when we think about vulnerability management, we often think about it in the terms of, do I have the latest operating system patches, or have I updated third-party applications to the latest version to address vulnerabilities? And while that is still very much so important, and Comply gives you that visibility, what SBOM allows us to do now is give you more detailed, more granular visibility into components, the DLLs, the shared libraries, that make up the applications in your environment and being able to identify where you may have vulnerabilities. And I'll be honest with you, the feedback that we've gotten from the field so far, Ashley, has been really positive, because one of the things that you certainly don't want to have is a false sense of security in your vulnerability management program. If you think that, hey, I've got my critical vulnerabilities managed, or maybe I'm good and I'm hitting my SLAs for remediation, but what if there are vulnerabilities in your environment that you just aren't aware are there? And what I'll do here is I'll actually show you guys first how Asset addressed this with the software bill of materials edition, which allows you to not only track components in the environment, so you can set this up with profiles within Asset. And I'll talk a little bit about more how those same profiles are essentially going to be used from a comply standpoint to identify vulnerabilities. But
this is really timely. I mean, you think about just setting up the business case for why are we doing this, right? I mean, there's those White House executive orders around cybersecurity, which name SBOM, software bill of materials specifically. And, I was just at a B-Sides conference here in town last week, and had two really good sessions on SBOM, and they were coming at it kind of from a software development standpoint, saying, number one, public service announcement, just really read those CVEs, because when you get in under the covers and the software, like, did the vendor really fix this component, and does it require a configuration change in that component or app to really make the remediation successful? So just really pay attention, read the details on those. And so now we have a way that we can help you. Like Joel said, this SBOM component is an add-on in Tanium that lights up capabilities in both the Asset module and the Comply module, right? So it's really important to get down in the weeds here. And so I'm really interested for people to see how we can do that now on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that's really cool to kind of just show, going from Asset, where, like I said, in our demo environment here, you see we already have some tracked shared libraries. We're tracking Log4j core, which, again, we're looking for Java here. And what you'll see is we have the ability to do this inventory across the environment, right? And be able to see at a high level, for example, OpenSSL, which is commonly used library in a lot of different applications. You'll see that it's used in a lot of different Linux distros, for example. OpenSSL, you could have many versions in your environment, right? But how do I know if any of these versions have known vulnerabilities tied to them, right? And this is where one of the things I like to point out is that where we really are able to key off of this is with what's called the Common Platform Enumerator, or CPE string. And you'll see here in the Asset report, under the libraries, we show the CPE string along with the vendor and version, and you see all these different places where OpenSSL is used. Now, when we take this over to Comply, we are using the same concept of identifying libraries, files, showing the Common Platform Enumerator, which will identify what that application is, the version that is affected. And then where that really pivots over and how we're able to do the vuln detection on there is that we leveraged a CVE to CPE mapping. Now, this is something that is produced by NIST or NVD, which, again, one of the leaders in identifying CVEs and vulnerabilities, and what the vendors will actually do. And I'll show you this here.
So just for our audience here, I want to make sure we define those terms. So you mentioned NVD really quick. So there it is on the screen, right?
National Vulnerability
Database.
Yes.
All right. Just want to make sure people are tracking with that.
Yep. So the National Vulnerability Database, again, maintains a library, if you will, of known vulnerabilities. And the part where this really gets interesting is you have the concept of the known affected software configuration. This is where, again, we have that Common Platform Enumerator, or CPE, and you can see these configuration strings here, right? These configuration strings, in this case, would identify OpenSSL and the version range where this particular vulnerability can be found. So just at a glance here, going from our Asset report, where we can see the different types or versions of OpenSSL that we have, and you can see that if I wanted to be able to identify those vulnerabilities in my environment, how could I do that? How could I say, hey, I have all these versions of OpenSSL. I'm not necessarily the one who's directly managing them or updating them, but I need to know when there are vulnerabilities present.
Man,
so
this
that's
is
exactly
great. I'm just thinking of, like, again, this B-sides event's fresh in my mind from last week. You know, the old adage that compliance is not security, right? But if you're not even looking at it from a compliance standpoint, that's just bare. You got to start there. That's your baseline, right?
Absolutely.
So you're looking beyond that to be fully secure, but what I find interesting here is we're actually able to say, okay, with Tanium Comply and this SBOM add-on, then you can actually do this direct mapping to NIST and NVD, and then also CISA KEV we're going to look at here in a minute. So it's really, Tanium is that data pump to help you meet these compliance standards, whether that helps you with your cybersecurity insurance or you're reporting to the board or whatever you're doing. It all comes down to these details. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think the really important thing to understand is that these are all things that, as a vulnerability manager or someone who is responsible for being able to report on or remediate vulnerabilities in an environment, prioritization is key, right? Understanding not just based on, how many findings I have or how many endpoints are vulnerable, but what is that severity? Is something actively being exploited, which we'll get into here in a minute and show you guys what we've done with the CISA KEV stuff. But what I want to show you real quick here, again, the investigations feature carries over into this SBOM capability. And this is where it's really awesome to see, us building on a feature that we initially had. We put it out there for vulnerability and compliance, and the feedback we got from customers was great, that they can now take this information and provide it to the remediation teams. Now, this is really key with SBOM because often there will be a vulnerability that is detected by SBOM where the remediation might not be as simple as deploy the latest patch or deploy the latest version of that software, right? And this is important, especially when you think about applications that are developed internally, right? This really starts to look into your development process to understand the components, the ingredients for my cookies that I'm putting together. Do I have individual vulnerabilities that are present there? And if so, what do I need to do? And it's kind of one of those things that, you can't always just go in and broadly update everything in your environment. I remember some of my first times working as a Linux administrator and understanding, the mechanism for doing like an app update and get updates for all your packages, right? Think of it as you have all of these components that make up your standard operating environment, right? So you may have applications that, for example, are used by your developers. This is really common. For example, things like Visual Studio Code, applications where a user can import plugins, right? So this is something that I've been able to observe as well with this feature, is that, I can have, plugins or extensions that I've installed in a software, and those extensions can include libraries and files that themselves might be vulnerable. So being able to identify, in this case, we have OpenSSL, right? And as I started off in Asset, we see that we have a plethora of different versions of OpenSSL in the environment. But how do I know which ones are vulnerable? This is where we can take that same concept of identifying the affected configuration or the vulnerable configuration via the common platform enumerator, and we can give you the details on the exact file path, the name, vendor, and version. So you see all of that. And again, in this investigations view, we're surfacing this for all of the endpoints that were found vulnerable here, right? So we asked the live question, we got this information. But this data is also available. Yeah.
Question for you. So that CPE string, how is that generated? Is that like in the installed application listing somewhere, or is that something we're calculating, or where does that come from?
We are generating that on our end. So that's something that we do. There is, so CPE is it's part of the SCAP, or Secure Content Automation Program, right? So CPE is one of the attributes that are defined within SCAP, right? And so essentially vendors be able to publish software, and generally speaking, what you're looking to get is the name of the software, the vendor, and the version. So the CPE string is a way to take that information, right? Whether we're pulling it from the file information, from the endpoint, or installed applications. There's different ways to be able to kind of put that CPE string together. Again, we're doing that on the back end. And then what we're able to do is then map that. We have the intel that, as I showed you what NIST and NVD put out, we actually take that and consume that as intel for the SBOM assessment. So shipped down to every endpoint is intel that says, here are a list of all known CPEs and the CVEs that they map to. And for the SBOM capability in Comply today, we are doing this specifically on application-based CPEs, right? So CPEs do extend over to hardware and operating system as well. And we're looking at some exciting things in the future, possibly being able to extend our detection to look at things like CPE for hardware, right? This is where we can start identifying things like firmware vulnerabilities that are identified with the CPE-H, for example. So one of the other things I wanted to just point out here, so as you're kind of setting up SBOM environment, it's important to understand that what we're doing on the back end is we are leveraging the Index solution, right? So Index is something that, for years we've used Index with threat response, and some of our other modules. Index gives you the ability to crawl the disk, hash and index files anywhere on the file system, right? And with that index capability, that's how we are able to do the identification of libraries, DLLs, and be able to map them to known vulnerabilities, right? And so one of the things that is new in Comply now is that we do allow you to do index configurations, and this is important to understand. So one of the important things to understand is that with leveraging Index, you do want to make sure that your index settings are in place. This is going to be one of the requirements in Comply to make sure that you're able to do that scan, right? So you need to be able to enable the SBOM feature using a configuration setting. And this is where you select the file types that we're going to do detection on, right? So this is very similar to how you would set this up in Asset if you were doing SBOM profile in Asset. Again, you select these file types for detection, your index scan frequency. So by default, we're going to do an index scan frequency of every 7 days, but this is something that you can modify and configure in your environment if you want to do those more frequently. And again, setting up your exclusions. This can be important if you have, for example, directories where you have files that are, a lot of like temp files that are changing frequently. This is something that can certainly impact index performance. By default, we are going to exclude the Tanium client directory. So you'll see those there as default exclusions. But again, as the administrator, you can configure these here. So once you have this configured, you just need to create one SBOM assessment. And again, you don't need to have multiple SBOM assessments in the environment. When you create an SBOM assessment, you're given the options to target your computer group. And so you can do your computer group targeting as broadly or granularly as you want. Again, we give you the ability to use the filter builder here and do more advanced targeting. But what you'll see here is that the scheduling is different than all of our other scans, right? We say that the scan runs continuously, and that's because on the back end, we are using Index to do that scan. So the Index configuration settings are what are going to manage the scheduling of your SBOM assessment. Once you've created the assessment here and you've got your settings in place,
hey, real quick, before you leave that, so I'm looking at the compliance scan type. So SBOM, is that implied that that's a client-based scan? Are we doing SBOM remotely, authenticated, things like that? Or is this just for the client-based type scan?
Great question. This is just for client-based scans because, again, SBOM is going to be leveraging Index to actually do the scan. So you need to have the client.
Right. Yeah.
We will actually distribute the Index tools and everything you need to run Index on the endpoint. To run the SBOM assessment on the endpoint. So you'll have Index, Software Manager, and then the extras client extension, which handles the scheduling. All that gets pushed down to the client. So that is all something to keep in mind here. When you select SBOM, it is a client-based scan. But in this case, instead of using oval vulnerability definitions, like I talked about, we are using the SBOM intel. That's why you don't see a section here where you're selecting any intel. So you don't have to select a range of CVEs. We are sending down the full intel, and we're doing that scan continuously with Index.
Okay. So just to kind of baseline there for everybody. So if you don't see the SBOM option here, there's an add-on that's an additional purchase that lights up the capabilities in Asset and Comply. And then here, the other requirement is that you will need the Tanium agent installed. This is not going to work remotely with the remote scanning capability. So it's good just to understand those requirements. Yeah.
But once you've got your scans done, again, your SBOM findings, they will show up with all of your other vulnerability findings. So when you're in findings, you'll be able to identify them based on the scan method. So you'll see this drop down here. You get the SBOM scan method. What I've done is I've just gone ahead and saved and created a report. One of the things that I find helps to add some context to the report here. So again, I've got my SBOM vulnerabilities report. I've went ahead, I've added the title, the CPE, which again, that common platform enumerator, and affected products. So it gives me some information at a glance as to what this vulnerability actually impacts in my environment.
You know, this is really interesting, Joel. I keep going back to this B-Sides conference I attended last week, because this one session on SBOM, they really talked about how developers, you know, today, a lot of software is, hey, just pull this library, that library. A lot of them's coming from open source, you know, and even not only, you know, commercial off the shelf software, but also in-house developed apps. A lot of times, you know, you need to practice safe coding practices so that you're not just bringing in the entire library. If you can bring in just pieces of that library, you don't need the whole thing. You're limiting your attack surface. So secure coding practices help here as well, looking all the way down. So that's the SBOM piece. What's next?
So let's talk about exception management. Again, exception management has been probably one of the most requested features in Comply. In my opinion, it is a table stakes feature for any vulnerability and compliance management tool, right? Because inevitably, you're going to have situations where there are going to be vulnerabilities in your environment that either you have acceptable risk in place, right? There are going to be, for example, applications where you know that you need to stay at this version of Java for a while, right? For example, and you know that, hey, my developers aren't going to get around to updating it. So I will need to put an exception in place to say that, hey, for this particular vulnerability on these endpoints, I want to accept that finding. And so that is where the exception features come in. And with the exceptions feature, again, we support this for both vulnerability findings and compliance. So you can create exceptions in a couple different ways, but at a high level, the important thing to understand is that when I accept the finding, by default, that finding is going to be hidden from my reports. So it means that I can still go in and see them and I can view them, but that is going to be a toggle. And I'll show you guys that here in a second. But the one thing to kind of point out when you're creating it, again, you have the ability to provide a reason for that. So again, we provide some ones out the box and you can provide other reasoning. Again, if you identify a false positive, for example, or if you have a compensating control, those are things that you can select as the reason. You can set an expiration date, right? So in most cases, say I go to my developer team and I say, hey, I need you to update Java in this application. They're like, hey, that's something that we plan to do in the next 3 months, right? So I can set an expiration date out. And what will automatically happen is that once that expiration date hits, that finding will start being reported again. So until that expiration date hits, that finding will be hidden from your default reporting. Endpoints will still be scanned for it. So exceptions do not mean that we're not scanning for the vulnerability. You will still have visibility as to whether or not that vulnerability exists on the endpoint or that compliance rule result, but it does hide it by default. And again, you can set an exception to active or inactive, right? So at any point in time, if you decide that you may need to put an exception again at a later date, you don't have to delete it. You can just mark it as inactive, come back to it later. And we give you some pretty powerful tools to build your exceptions. So again, with the filter builder criteria here, you can choose, if I'm doing compliance, I have the option to tool based on the rule, standard, profile, severity. If I choose vulnerability, again, we allow you to create these using various parts of the CVE metadata, right? So for example, I wanted to put an exception in for unscored CVEs on certain endpoints where, you know, I'm okay with having those non-critical CVEs or CVEs that don't have a noteworthy severity, and I'm not worried about addressing those in remediation for a while. I can put in a exception for those and set an expiration date, right? And you can target endpoints by selecting a computer group, and we've got some additional filter criteria. So one of the things that you will see is when you do have exceptions in the environment, we're going to show this new filter option to show accepted findings. So for example, if I'm looking at my vulnerability findings count, you look here and I click show accepted findings, you're going to see that this count has increased. Now, if I want to actually see what findings have been accepted, if I'm on the all findings view, so when you apply an exception, it gets applied at the endpoint level, right? So you're not going to see it on like the overview or the check ID view, but you will be able to see it in all findings. So for example, if I wanted to add an additional filter here, so I can do my CV findings and I say I only want to see accepted, for example. I can create a report, which is just my accepted findings in the environment. And then I can also add this column here that shows me whether or not that finding has been accepted. So you get a little checkbox here that lets you know this finding is accepted in the environment. Again, by default, it's not going to show up in your report. So when you have exceptions in place, that is not going to impact your overall vulnerability posture or compliance reporting. But again, you do have the ability to include these in your report. So if you need to get that to your team to say, hey, you've got these exceptions that are coming up that are going to be expiring soon that you need to address, you can get them that reporting around that.
Man, this is really nice. I mean,
yeah,
obviously there's this sneaky feeling in the back of your mind, like, hey, we could just make ourselves look really good and accept all these things, you know, but then you can still have visibility to see, okay,
absolutely.
Here are the things that we're kind of choosing to ignore, whether it's a legitimate, you know, false positive, or this some old application that's, you know, costs a lot of money on special hardware and it's in a, you know, compensating controls and a network segment. You know, there are some legitimate reasons to use this. And like you said, people have been asking for this for a long time. It looks like it's really helpful.
Absolutely.
Really
I mean, I think on the compliance side, there's a really big use case for it, right? Because many of our customers, they're going to have, you know, like their own security baseline that they've defined for their environment, right? So say you're using a CIS benchmark and there's a rule that defines that your password history or password age is X value, but maybe you've changed that, or you're using a custom check instead. So maybe the reporting for that rule tells you that, hey, you failed this check, but you've got a compensating control in place, or you've got a custom check that you want to use. And that's perfectly fine. You can then go in, accept that value. And so then your reporting will be more accurately reflective of what is actually considered a pass and fail for your environment. So it's definitely something that for customers who do a lot of customization around their compliance scans, or if they have SLAs in place for vulnerabilities, and maybe for the team, you're not tracking your unscored vulnerabilities, for example, or you want to put exceptions in place for them, you've got that capability now. And so we've been getting really good feedback from the field on it. So excited to have it in folks' hands.
I'm just seeing this and envisioning this scenario where people are exporting their findings from Tanium and then they have to go into Excel and strike these rows for every month, you know, on their reports. All right, we know this wasn't, but now it's all taken care of.
You got to do that. Exactly.
That's great. Yeah.
Yep. And the one other thing, and I'll just kind of pivot on this from a reporting standpoint. So I showed this a little bit on our last session. I talked about what we're doing to bring in visibility into the CISA KEV list. And we have a default report that we've put out there for CISA KEV. And essentially, you'll see that we've also got the ability to filter on that just right here in our findings, right? So being able to see vulnerabilities that have been identified as part of the CISA known exploited vulnerability catalog, right? We get all this extra information here in our flyout. And what we wanted to do is be able to provide a better reporting mechanism for our customers around this. So we've now created and shipped a managed dashboard, which I want to show you real quick here.
And just a baseline here for our audience, if you don't know what CISA KEV is. So CISA has published the known exploited vulnerability list that they keep updated. So basically, these are, so you think you've got all these vulnerabilities in your environment. These are the ones that we know are actively being exploited to attack you. So these are the ones you should prioritize then to remediate first, especially if you intersect that with, you know, criticality and which machines are critical in your environment. And then we know we've got these exploits. It really helps you assess, because think about that's part of the workflow of security, right? Is prioritization. So we're really helping with that here.
100%, Ashley. And I think that's one of the things that with this dashboard at a glance, I can come in and I can see what the top exploited vulnerabilities are in the environment. CISA will actually identify these vulnerabilities by vendor and product. One of the other really cool things that they'll do is they'll let you know what the required action is. So in many cases, the required action is to apply the vendor update. But in some cases, they will identify certain applications as being end of life, right? When you have vulnerability in an end of life application, that is an indication that you should remove that application from your network. And that's what we've done here with this chart on the left here. When they've identified a vulnerability as being associated with an end of life product, we can break that out and give you that overview of what are those products in your environment that you should probably be looking to sunset and remove, right, to address this. And so having this and being able to track over time the remediation of exploited vulnerabilities as new vulnerabilities are added. I mean, this is something that now I get emails every week from CISA adding new vulnerabilities. So this is something that we update constantly with the Tanium vulnerability library. So as CISA adds new things to the list, that is updated for customers in their environment every day. So you can always come in here and see the latest information on what's being actively exploited in the wild and to help you prioritize your remediation efforts.
Man, I just crossed 6 years at Tanium, and watching this module come out of nowhere to grow to this level of maturity is really refreshing to see how, wow. Yeah. I mean, this really is a robust scan to give you a lot of data about your environment, that, you know, collating all these compliance sources. I mean, you've got to report on this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so now we've got that visibility, the prioritization. This is really good news.
And to your point, Ashley, like the feedback that we get from customers is super valuable in this. As I was working on this dashboard, I was talking to customers and trying to understand what are the reporting requirements they have. And that's one of the cool things about with the reporting capability, we now have the ability to put on data from all across the platform, right? So a customer can take this dashboard, they can customize it. If you want to be able to focus on specific sets of endpoints or the critical assets in your environment, you kind of have this framework that you can build off of. And that's what I love about the extensibility of the platform and what we're doing about pulling in these critical data feeds and making available to customers. This is what folks are asking for, and this is what we've been excited about delivering.
Man, so in previous episodes when you were here and I'd say, hey, what's coming next? You were hinting at some of these things, and now we actually get to see it again based on customer feedback. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time here. Anything else you want to make sure people take away from today's episode?
Yeah, honestly, I think the main thing that we want to do is just encourage folks to take advantage of the managed content that we're putting out there. This is one of the things that, for those of you guys who are familiar with our feed notifications, we put out information when we've got new features available. But one of the things that we're also doing with our emergent issues content is letting folks know that when there are vulnerabilities that are critical, that, you know, things that are newsworthy and popping up, we are wanting to make this information readily available in the console for our customers, giving them ways to track and take action. So I would say keep an eye on feed. Again, we've got new stuff coming all the time, but there's a lot of really good stuff that's coming out that our customers can really take advantage of to help them be more proactive in managing vulnerabilities in their environment and getting that visibility and control with the platform.
Well, Joel, thanks again for this tour. This has been really good. I mean, it just keeps getting better. I've said that in the past, but wow, this is adding significant value to what people are getting in the Comply module. So now we've got today SBOM capabilities getting lit up in the capabilities here with that add-on, then the exception management, which people have been asking for a long time, and then this rich prioritization information with the CISA KEV. So stack all that together and then come get your hands on it at Converge this November. Would love to see you get either, again, in person or virtually remote. Take advantage of getting some training. Also, I'll always send you to our docs.tanium.com, right, where you can get these details on how this works, and then interact with people at community.tanium.com and ask your questions there, talk to other customers, see how they're using it as well. So lots of resources for you. Also in the show notes below, there's a community post that talks about this specific SBOM release with those capabilities were turned on. And this is all available now, right? So you don't have to wait. This is already available. If you've licensed that SBOM add-on, you're going to see those capabilities as well. Now, the exception management and the CISA KEV, that's for every Comply license.
That's right.
The SBOM,
every Comply customer.
Yep. The SBOM is the only one that requires an add-on to get that capability. So thanks again for showing us this tour today, Joel.
Absolutely.
And thank you for joining us on today's episode of Tanium Tech Talks. And until next time, go Tanium.